Hi, Bryan Post here. And you may have been told before to parent according to the stage and not the age. So in this video, I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about exactly what that means, because that can be kind of confusing for parents as well as for professionals. And here's the thing. There are 4 ages when it comes to your child. The most common is the chronological age. So this is the age however old your child is. And then there's the physical age. This is the size of your child. And then there is the cognitive age, and this is more along the lines of their level of intelligence and where they are functioning in a moment of processing. And then the fourth, and the most important, is the emotional age. Now here's the thing, with adopted and foster children, and with trauma in general, trauma impacts the developmental stages. So whatever the normal developmental trajectory is with a child, when a traumatic event occurs, and remember, a traumatic event can be any stressful event which is prolonged, overwhelming, or unpredictable. And when that event continues on without our ability to express, process, and understand, that stressful event can become, instead of just a short-term stressful experience, it can become a lifelong, potentially brain-altering, stressful event. And so that is what trauma is. And that's why trauma is so much more than just the common sexual abuse and emotional abuse and neglect and maltreatment that we are all, when you work in adoption and foster care, you're all familiar with those, with the descriptions of those experiences, and lesser so the reality that trauma can be any stressful event which is prolonged, overwhelming, and unpredictable. So the significance is that when one of those events occurs, usually in a child's early developmental life, they are referred to as developmental traumas. Developmental traumas create barriers to the later forming developmental stages. And so then what will happen is that when a trauma occurs in a child's life, they will continue to grow. They'll continue to grow cognitively. They'll continue to grow physically. They'll continue to get older and age chronologically. But the thing is, they become stunted emotionally. So in some instances, they may be able to demonstrate that they're operating at a higher emotional level. The significance about when these events occur in the context of trauma is that the stressor that is occurring in that moment will cause that child to regress. Now, Alan Shore says that some adults in instances of high stress have the ability to revert to infancy. And Bruce Perry also refers this to as any time the brain is under a state of stress, it will revert to an earlier developmental stage. And this is where we start talking about parenting the stage and not the age, because your child could be 10 years old, but in the peak of a stressful experience, they could revert back to the time when they were 10, or to the time that they were 2, or the time that they were an infant. They could be 15 and in a stressful experience will revert back to the time that they were 2 or the time that they were an infant. And so then what happens when you're parenting according to the age, give you a great example. Recently, I had one of my members of my certification program said that her son, who's I think 10, 11, 12 years old, still wets himself sometimes in the middle of the day. And she said her husband gets really frustrated with him, because if you're looking at a 12-year-old and a 12-year-old is all of a sudden wetting himself, it's hard to comprehend, because that is not correlated to the age. At 12 or 10 or whatever age beyond 2, you're supposed to be potty trained and supposed to be able to go to the bathroom when you need to go to the bathroom. However, if it's your 12-year-old and it's in the middle of the day and they wet themselves, it's easy for parents to become completely frustrated and overwhelmed because of that. However, what you're missing in that moment is that 12-year-old, most likely, due to whatever stressors are going on in their life, and I always say that children, just like adults, have a window of tolerance for how much stress that they can tolerate. And as the day goes on and as stressors increase, that window of tolerance gets bigger. Well, that 12-year-old under stress reverts to a 2-year-old, or to an 18-month-old or to a 12-month-old. And if that's occurring, what may look like 12 is in fact emotionally a 2-year-old. Now, would you get upset if your 2-year-old wet their pants? No, you wouldn't, because you'd have a greater understanding. Well, this is the significance of parenting the stage instead of the age, and that really is one of the reasons why we create a lot of frustration in our society these days when it comes to children who've experienced early traumatic experiences, or what Nadine Burke-Harris would refer to as adverse childhood experiences, because they grow older after the experience. They grow smarter typically after the experience, but they really struggle emotionally. And this is really evident in schools as well as in homes. But in schools, you have, say, a 12-year-old who is just not on par with all the other 12-year-olds. Yet, because he looks 12, because a lot of the times he acts 12, then we tend to want to associate him at being 12. But then what we're forgetting in that moment is the emotional developmental stage. And so when you are instructed to parent the stage instead of the age, what you're really being instructed to do is to slow down and to consider in that moment, if you were to set aside any beliefs that your child is doing something intentionally or doing something because they're willfully disobedient or because they're trying to manipulate a situation, which are all a part of a fear-based paradigm, if you were able to set that aside for a moment, and whatever the behavior it is your child demonstrates, if you were just to say, I wonder developmentally where this could be coming from, you would be surprised the depth of understanding that you could achieve of your child's behavior in that moment. And then what you do is you say, what were the circumstances going on leading up to that moment when your child, who's 12, demonstrated a behavior like he was a 2-year-old? That's the second thing you can do. Then the third thing, what I want you to do is I want you to really evaluate what was the circumstances of your child in early childhood? What were the potential traumatic events? What were the separations? What were the exposures to the adverse childhood experiences that your child may have gone through? Because any number of those at any stage in that earlier development, even as young back as in utero, could cause your child now, as a 12-year-old, when under stress, to revert all the way back to when he was 2. And then because we don't associate that, we forget about it, we don't pay attention to it, maybe we don't know it at all, you're treating a 12-year-old like a 12-year-old and then completely missing the boat. And this is why I always say children don't grow older, they don't grow better, they only grow older. Because the majority of the practices that we utilize when it comes to children today, especially parenting practices and tools and techniques for correction and training and discipline, and the definition of discipline is to teach, not to punish, but the majority of those practices, like your timeouts, your punishments, your consequences, your behavior modification charts, your medications over modifications of environments and relationships, or spanking or yelling, which are the kind of more socially common outside of adoption and foster care, even though they occur in adoption and foster care. By and large, those practices only create more stress. Now, a traumatic event is a stressful event. If a traumatic event occurs in early childhood development and creates a developmental barrier to the future development, then it only makes sense that if you're using tools and techniques and practices, parenting practices towards your child, and granted, most parents don't even realize this is happening, which is the beauty of this video. You don't realize that the practices you're using are actually creating more stress. And if they're creating more stress, they're actually not creating a healing opportunity for the brain. Because your brain requires prolonged states of regulation and repetition of positive engagement, positive relationships, positive attunement, positive interactions in any stressful situation that may occur. So getting back to the final point, parenting the state instead of the age is going to require you to have to slow down. It's going to have to require you to suspend the negative judgment that your child is intentionally doing something, that they just don't want to act their age, that they're just acting immature, or they're just being lazy. See, all of those are negatively reinforcing constructs, all very commonly supported in our society. But if you truly want to parent the stage and not the age, then you have to slow down. You have to ask yourself, what age could my child be behaving right now? Let me go back and review what was going on in their life during that time. And now let me show up and support them in that way. Now, how do you support a 12-year-old who's regressed to a 2-year-old? Do you talk to him like a 2-year-old? No, you don't. But what you do is you address him with more compassion, more understanding, and then you have to be willing to take more responsibility. So the parent who's willing to take responsibility is the parent who says, you know what, son, I can tell at 12, even though I know you would love to not have these wedding issues because they can be embarrassing, and I'd love for you not to have these issues. I can tell that something got missed somewhere along the way in your early development. Now, it may have gotten missed for any number of reasons, and if you are aware and you can revisit those early experiences with your child, those early traumatic experiences with your child, it's going to be that much better. But if you can't, just say, hey, it looks like we're going to have to try to make this up. Because what happens in trauma is that there's a little nerve bundle in your brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And what it controls are your circadian rhythms. Your circadian rhythms are directly responsible for the brain and body connection. So when your bladder is full, your circadian rhythms kick in and send a signal to your brain that says, hey, I need to go release my bladder. Or when your bowels are ready to be released, the suprachiasmatic nucleus sends the signal that says, hey, I need to go to the bathroom. Well, trauma and early neglect disrupts that mechanism, that suprachiasmatic connection, that mechanism between the brain and the body. So what you have to do is you have to reestablish that with your child. And that's why when you put a child on a potty training routine, and I am serious about this, you can have a 12-year-old. If your 12-year-old's having accidents like a 2-year-old, then he's got some gaps that need to be addressed and need to be healed. And the only way to do that, in my experience, I've found, is that the parent is willing to take responsibility, put the child on a potty training routine every 2.5, 3 hours. Just say, hey, bud, why don't you go use the bathroom? Simple as that. If the child's resistant, back off. Don't push it. It doesn't have to be a forced thing. Wait a little while and say, hey, no, I'm serious. I'd hate for you to have an accident because I know you don't intend for that to happen. But unless we get back into a good habit of going to the bathroom on a routine, accidents are probably going to happen. So let's just bypass all that. And let's get you on the right track. And 9 times out of 10, your child's going to go along with you. And so the other thing is just to, in the most non-threatening way, support them in the process, have the repetition, give them the feedback and the reinforcement when they need to go to the bathroom. Be responsible. See, most parents wait to be reactive. Be responsible and set your child up on a structure and a routine where you're actually the one going to them and encouraging them. And if you'll do this, usually, for older children, it's about a 60 to a 90-day process. If you can do it consistently, sometimes it doesn't even take that long, but I'm giving you a 60 to 90-day process to overcome something that most of you have probably been dealing with for years. So that's the answer. If you want to parent the stage and not the age, you have to meet the child where they're at emotionally. And it could be any number of things. It could be hyperactivity, it could be aggression, it could be any number of things. You have to see where they're at emotionally and address the emotion. And the best way to address the emotion is with your own compassion, your own understanding, and your own attunement. You've got to be emotional yourself, but not emotional in some loud kind of way, but emotional in a connected way that says, I understand where this is coming from. And because I understand where this is coming from, I want to help you and I want to support you. So I hope that's helpful for you. Remember, parent the stage and not the age means to slow down, connect to the emotional age and not get lost on the chronological, the physical, or the cognitive. And remember, in times of stress, children regress to earlier developmental stages. If you can do that consistently, I think you'll be able to overcome those challenges quicker than you could imagine. And in the meantime, if you have any other challenges or issues and you just need to have a question you want to ask or you want to join a community of support, please check out bondify.ai. That is my 24/7 available AI-powered parenting support app for adoptive and foster families. Adoptive and foster families should not go through each day experiencing a crisis and not knowing where to help. And you don't have to wait until the next week to see your therapist. With Bondify, you open up Bondify AI. Bryan Post AI is on there. You ask me a question, I'm going to give you a response as good as this one and possibly even give you some resources to help you on your path. God bless you. We'll talk to you soon.